Section 36 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous, translated by Dr. Jonathan Scott, 1754 to 1829. The Story of Noor ad-Deen and the Fair Persian, Part 6. Fair Persian, said Noor ad-Deen, immediately addressing himself to her, I ask that favour of you, and I hope you will not refuse me. She took up the lute without more entreaties, and, putting it presently in tune, played and sung with such an air as charmed the very soul of the Caliph. Afterwards she played upon the lute without singing, but with so much strength and softness as to transport him into an ecstasy. When the fair Persian had given over playing, the Caliph cried out, What a voice! What a hand! What skill! Was there ever finer singing or better playing upon the lute? Never was there any seen or heard like it. Noor ad-Deen, who was accustomed to give all that belonged to him to persons who praised him, said, Fisherman, I found thou hast some taste for music. Since thou art so delighted with her performance, she is thine. I make thee a present of her. At the same time he rose up, and taking his robe, which he had laid by, was going away, and leaving the Caliph, whom he believed to be no other than a fisherman, in possession of the fair Persian. The fair Persian was extremely surprised at Noor ad-Deen's liberality. She took hold of him, and looking tenderly at him, Whither, sir, said she, are you going? Sit down in your place, I entreat you, and hearken to what I am going to sing and play. He did as she desired him, and then the fair Persian, touching the lute and looking upon him with tears in her eyes, sung some verses that she had made extempore, to reproach him with his indifference, and the easiness as well as cruelty with which he resigned her to Karim. She only hinted, without explaining herself any further to a fisherman, for she, as well as Noor ad-Deen, was ignorant of his being the Caliph. When she had done playing, she put the lute down by her, and clapped the handkerchief to her face to hide the tears she could not repress. Noor ad-Deen made no answer to all these reproaches, but by his silence seemed to declare he did not repent of what he had done. The Caliph, surprised at what he had heard, said, Sir, as far as I see, this beautiful, rare, and accomplished lady, of whom so generously you have made me a present, is your slave? It is very true, Karim, replied Noor ad-Deen, and thou wouldest be more surprised than thou art now, should I tell thee all the misfortunes that have happened to me upon her account. Ah, I beseech you, sir, replied the Caliph, still behaving like a fisherman, oblige me so far as to let me hear part of your story. Noor ad-Deen, who had already obliged him in several things of more consequence, was so complacent as to relate the whole story to him. He began with the vizier his father's buying the fair Persian for the king of Bassorah, and omitted nothing of what he had done, or what had happened to him, from that time to their arrival at Baghdad, and to the very moment he was talking to him. When Noor ad-Deen had ended his story, And whither are you going now? asked the Caliph. Where heaven shall direct me, answered Noor ad-Deen. If you will believe me, replied the Caliph, you shall go no further, but, on the contrary, you must return to Bassorah. I will write a short letter, which you shall give the king in my name. You shall see upon the reading it, he will give you a very handsome reception, and nobody will dare to speak against you. Karim, said Noor ad-Deen, what thou hast told me is very singular. I never heard that a poor fisherman, as thou art, had any correspondence with a king. Be not astonished at that, replied the Caliph. You must know that we both studied together under the same masters, and were always the best friends in the world. It is true, fortune has not been equally favourable to us. She has made him a king and me a fisherman, but this inequality has not lessened our friendship. He has often expressed a readiness and desire to advance my fortune, but I always refused, and am better pleased with the satisfaction of knowing that he will never deny me whatever I ask for the service and advantage of my friends. Let me do it, and you shall see the success." Noor ad-Deen consented to what the Caliph had proposed, and there being everything necessary for writing in the hall, the Caliph wrote a letter to the King of Bassorah, at the top of which he placed his form, in the name of the most merciful God, to shew he would be absolutely obeyed. Harun al-Rashid, son of Mahdi, sends the letter to Zinebi, his cousin. As soon as Noor ad-Deen, son to the late Vizier Khacan, the bearer, has delivered you this letter, and you have read it, pull off the royal vestments, put them on his shoulders, and place him in thy seat without fail. Farewell." The Caliph folded up the letter, sealed it, and giving it to Noor ad-Deen without saying anything of what was in it, "Go," said he, "embark immediately in a vessel that is ready to go off, as there did constantly every day at the same hour. You may sleep when you are aboard." Noor ad-Deen took the letter and departed with the little money he had about him, when Sanjir gave him his purse, and the fair Persian, distracted with grief at his departure, retired to one of the sofas and wept bitterly. Noor ad-Deen was scarcely gone out of the hall when Sheikh Ibrahim, who had been silent during the whole transaction, looking steadfastly upon the Caliph, whom he still took for the fisherman Karim, "Hark!" said he, "Karim, thou hast brought us 2 fishes that are worth 20 pieces of copper at most, and thou hast got a purse and a slave, but dost thou think to have all for thyself? I here declare that I will go halves with thee in the slave, and as for the purse, shew me what is in the inside. If it is silver, thou shalt have 1 piece for thyself, but if it is gold, I will have it all, and give thee in exchange some pieces of copper which I have in my purse." The Caliph, before his serving up the fish, had dispatched the Grand Vizier to his palace, with orders to get 4 slaves with a rich habit, and to wait on the other side of the pavilion till he gave a signal with his finger against the window. The Grand Vizier performed his commission, and he, Mesrour, and the 4 slaves waited at the appointed place, expecting the sign. The Caliph, still personating the fisherman, answered Sheikh Ibrahim boldly, "I know not what there is in the purse. Gold or silver, you shall freely go my halves, but as to the slave, I will have her all to myself, and if you will not accept these conditions, you shall have nothing." Sheikh Ibrahim, enraged to the last degree at this insolence, considering him only as a fisherman, snatched up one of the china dishes which were on the table, and flung it at the Caliph's head. The Caliph easily avoided the blow, being thrown by a person in liquor, but the dish, striking against the wall, was dashed into 1,000 pieces. Sheikh Ibrahim grew more enraged at having missed his aim, and catching up the candle that stood upon the table, rose from his seat and went staggering down a pair of back stairs to look for a cane. The Caliph took this opportunity, and striking his hands against the window, the Grand Vizier Mesrour and the 4 slaves were with him in an instant. The slaves quickly pulled off the fisherman's clothes, and put him on the habit they had brought. They had not quite dressed the Caliph, who had seated himself on the throne that was in the hall, but were busy about him, when Sheikh Ibrahim, spurred on by interest, came back with a cane in his hand, with which he designed to pay the pretended fisherman soundly. But instead of finding him, he saw his clothes in the middle of the hall, and the Caliph on his throne, with the Grand Vizier and Mesrour on each side of him. He stood a while gazing on this unexpected sight, doubting whether he was awake or asleep. The Caliph fell a laughing at his astonishment, and calling to him, "Sheikh Ibrahim," said he, What dost thou want? Whom dost thou look after?" Sheikh Ibrahim, no longer doubting that it was the Caliph, immediately threw himself at his feet, with his face and long beard to the ground. "Commander of the true believers," cried he, "your vile slave has offended you, but he implores your clemency, and asks 1,000 pardons for his offence." As soon as the slaves had finished dressing him, he came down from his throne, and advancing towards him, "Rise," said he, "I forgive thee." The Caliph then addressed himself to the fair Persian, who had suspended her sorrow as soon as she understood that the garden and pavilion belonged to that prince and not to Sheikh Ibrahim, as he had all along made her believe, and that it was he himself disguised in the fisherman's clothes. "Fair Persian," said he, "rise and follow me. By what you have lately seen, you ought to know who I am, and to believe that I am above taking any advantage of the present which Noor ad-Deen, with a generosity not to be paralleled, has made me of your person. I have sent him to Bassorah as king, and when I have given him the dispatches necessary for his establishment, you shall go thither and be queen. In the meantime, I am going to order an apartment for you in my palace, where you shall be treated according to your desert." This discourse encouraged the fair Persian, and comforted her very sensibly. The joy for the advancement of Noor ad-Deen, whom she passionately loved, to so high an honour, made her sufficient amends for her affliction. The Caliph kept his promise, and recommended her to the care of his Empress Zobeide, whom he acquainted with the esteem he had entertained for Noor ad-Deen. Noor ad-Deen's return to Bassorah was more fortunate and speedier by some days than he could have expected. Upon his arrival, without visiting any of his friends or relations, he went directly to the palace, where the king at that time was giving public audience. With the letter held up in his hand, he pressed through the crowd, who presently made way for him to come forward and deliver it. The king took and opened it, and his colour changed in reading it. He kissed it thrice, and was just about to obey the Caliph's orders, when he bethought himself of strewing it to the Vizier Saouy, Noor ad-Deen's irreconcilable enemy. Saouy, who had discovered Noor ad-Deen, and began to conjecture, with great uneasiness, what might be the design of his coming, was no less surprised than the king at the order contained in the letter, and being as much concerned in it, he instantly devised a method to evade it. He pretended not to have read the letter quite through, and therefore, desiring a second view of it, turned himself a little on one side, as if he wanted a better light, and without being perceived by anybody, dexterously tore off from the top of it the form which shewed the Caliph would be absolutely obeyed, and putting it into his mouth, swallowed it. After this egregious piece of villainy, Saouy turned to the king, and giving him the letter, "Sir," said he to him in a low voice, "what does your majesty intend to do?" "What the Caliph has commanded me," replied the king. "Have a care, sir," said the wicked vizier, "what you do. It is true this is the Caliph's hand, but the form is not to it." The king had observed it, but in his confusion thought his eyes had deceived him when he saw it was gone. "Sir," continued the vizier, "we have no reason to doubt but that the Caliph, on the complaints he has made against your majesty and myself, has granted him this letter to get rid of him, and not with any intention of having the order contained in it executed. Besides, we must consider he has sent no express with a patent, and without that the order is of no force, and since a king like your majesty was never deposed without that formality, any other man as well as Noor ad-Deen might come with a forged letter. Let who will bring such a letter as this, it ought not to be put in execution. Your majesty may depend upon it, that is never done, and I will take upon myself all the consequence of disobeying this order." King Zinebi, easily persuaded by this pernicious counsel, left Noor ad-Deen entirely to the discretion of the Vizier Saouy, who led him to his house in a very insulting manner, and after causing him to be bastinaded till he was almost dead, he ordered him to a prison, where he commanded him to be put into the darkest and deepest dungeon, with a strict charge to the jailer to give him nothing but bread and water. When Noor ad-Deen, half dead with the strokes, came to himself, and found what a dismal dungeon he was in, he bewailed his misfortunes in the most pathetic manner. "Ah, fisherman!" cried he, "how hast thou cheated me, and how easy have I been in believing thee! Could I, after the civility I shewed thee, expect such inhuman and barbarous usage? However, may Heaven reward thee, for I cannot persuade myself that thy intention was so base, and I will with patience wait the end of my afflictions." The disconsolate Noor ad-Deen remained 6 whole days in this miserable condition, and Saouy did not forget that he had confined him there, but being resolved to put him to a shameful death, and not daring to do it by his own authority, to accomplish his villainous design, loaded some of his slaves with rich presents, which he, at the head of them, went and presented to the king. "Behold, sire," said he with the blackest malice, "what the new king has sent you upon his accession to the crown, and begs your majesty to accept." The king, taking the matter just as Saouy intended, "What!" replied he, "is that wretch still living? I thought you had put him to death already." "Sir, I have no power," answered the vizier, "to take any person's life. That only belongs to your majesty." "Go," said the king, "behead him instantly. I give you full authority." "Sire," replied the vizier Saouy, "I am infinitely obliged to your majesty for the justice you do me, but since Noor ad-Deen has publicly affronted me, I humbly beg the favour that his execution may be performed before the palace, and that the criers may publish it in every quarter of the city, so that everybody may be satisfied he has made a sufficient reparation for the affront." The king granted his request, and the criers, in performing their office, diffused universal sorrow through the whole city. The memory of his father's virtues being yet fresh among them, no one could hear without horror and indignation that the son was going to suffer an ignominious death. Saouy went in person to the prison, accompanied by 20 slaves, ministers of his cruelty, who took Noor ad-Deen out of the dungeon, and put him upon a shabby horse without a saddle. When Noor ad-Deen saw himself in the hands of his enemy, "Thou triumphest now," said he, "and abusest thy power, but I trust in the truth of what is written in our scripture. You judge unjustly, and in a little time you shall be judged yourself." The vizier Saouy triumphed in his heart. "What! Insolent!" said he, "darest thou insult me yet? But I care not what may happen to me, so I have the pleasure of seeing thee lose thy head in the public view of all Bussorah. Thou oughtest also to remember what another of our books says. What signifies if one dies the next day after the death of his enemy?" The vizier, implacable in his hatred and enmity, surrounded by his slaves in arms, conducted Noor ad-Deen towards the palace. The people were ready to fall upon him as he passed, and if any one had set the example, would certainly have stoned him to death. When he had brought him to the place of suffering, which was to be in sight of the king's apartment, he left him in the executioner's hands, and went straight to the king, who was in his closet ready to glut his eyes with the bloody spectacle he had prepared. The king's guard and the vizier's slaves, who made a circle round Noor ad-Deen, had much trouble to withstand the people, who made all possible efforts to break through and carry him off by force. The executioner, coming up to him, said, "I hope you will forgive me. I am but a slave, and cannot help doing my duty. If you have no occasion for anything more, I beseech you to prepare yourself, for the king is just going to give me orders to strike the blow." The unfortunate Noor ad-Deen, at that moment, looking round upon the people, "Will no charitable body," cried he, "bring me a little water to quench my thirst?" Which immediately they did, and handed it up to him upon the scaffold. The Vizier Saouy, perceiving this delay, called out to the executioner from the king's closet window, where he had planted himself, "Strike! What dost thou stay for?" At these inhuman words the whole place echoed with loud imprecations against him, and the king, jealous of his authority, made it appear, by enjoining him to stop a while, that he was angry at his presumption. But there was another reason, for the king that very moment, casting his eye towards a street that faced him, saw a troop of horsemen advancing full speed towards the palace. "Vizier," said the king immediately, "look yonder. What is the meaning of those horsemen?" Saouy, who knew not who they might be, earnestly pressed the king to give the executioner the sign. "No," replied the king, "I will first know who those horsemen are." It was the Vizier Jaaffier with his train, who came in person from Bagdad by the Caliph's order. To understand the occasion of this minister's coming to Bassorah, we must observe that after Noor ad-Deen's departure with the letter, the Caliph the next day, nor for several days after, thought not of sending him the patent which he mentioned to the fair Persian. He happened one day to be in the inner palace, which was that of the women, and passing by her apartment, heard the sound of a fine voice. He listened to it, and he had no sooner heard the words of one complaining for the absence of somebody, than he asked the officer of the eunuchs, who attended him, who the woman was that lived in that apartment. The officer told him it was the young stranger's slave, whom he had sent to Bassorah to be king in the room of Mohammed Zinebi. "Ah, poor Noor ad-Deen!" cried the Caliph, "I had forgotten thee, but hasten," said he to the officer, "and bid Jaaffier come to me." The Vizier was with him in an instant. As soon as he came, "Jaaffier," said he, "I have hitherto neglected sending the patent which was to confirm Noor ad-Deen king of Bassorah, but we have no time now to draw up one. Therefore immediately take post horses, and with some of your servants make what haste you can to that city. If Noor ad-Deen is no longer alive, but put to death by them, order the Vizier Saouy to be impaled, but if he is living, bring him to me with the king and the Vizier." The Grand Vizier stayed no longer than just to get on horseback, and being attended by a great train of officers belonging to his household, departed for Bassorah, where he arrived in the manner and at the time already mentioned. As soon as he came to the palace yard, the people cleared the way for him, crying out, "A pardon for Noor ad-Deen!" and with his whole train he rode into the palace, even to the very stairs, where he alighted. The king of Bassorah, knowing him to be the Caliph's chief minister, went to meet him, and received him at the entrance of his apartment. The first question the Vizier asked was, if Noor ad-Deen was living, and if he was, he desired that he might be sent for. The king made answer he was alive, and gave orders to have him brought in. Accordingly he soon made his appearance as he was, bound with cords. The Grand Vizier Jaaffier caused him to be unbound, and setting him at liberty, ordered the Vizier Saouy to be seized, and bound him with the same cords. The Grand Vizier remained but one night at Bassorah, and, according to the order he had received, carried Saouy, the king of Bassorah, and Noor ad-Deen along with him. Upon his arrival at Bagdad, he presented them to the Caliph, and after he had given him an account of his journey, and particularly the miserable condition in which he found Noor ad-Deen, and his ill usage by the advice and malice of Saouy, the Caliph desired Noor ad-Deen to behead the Vizier himself. "Commander of the true believers," said the generous youth, "notwithstanding the injury this wicked man has done me, and the mischief he endeavoured to do my deceased father, I should think myself the basest of mankind if I stained my hands with his blood." The Caliph was pleased with his generosity, and ordered justice to be done by the executioner. The Caliph would fain have sent Noor ad-Deen to Basra as king, but he humbly begged to be excused from accepting the offer. "Commander of the true believers," said Noor ad-Deen, "the city of Basra, after the misfortunes that have happened to me there, will be so much my aversion, that I beseech your Majesty to give me leave to keep the oath which I have made, of never returning thither again, and I shall think it my greatest glory to serve near your royal person, if you are pleased to allow me the honour." The Caliph consented, and placing him among the number of those courtiers who were his greatest favourites, restored the fair Persian to him again. To all these favours he added a plentiful fortune, and he and the fair Persian lived together thenceforth with all the happiness this world could afford. As for the king of Basra, the Caliph contented himself with hinting how careful he ought to be in the choice of his viziers, and sent him back to his kingdom. End of section 36. Recording by Nicole. End of the Arabian Nights Entertainments Volume 2 by Anonymous. Translated by Dr. Jonathan Scott.